friends ever since.
When it comes to making music, some people are really good at coming up with an idea for a melody, or a rhythm, or even a full arrangement in advance, and then using the gear that they've got to recreate what they hear, or maybe what they wanted to hear anyway in their head. That has never really been my approach, and whilst often I will start with a particular instrument, or a sequencer, or maybe even a sample, I kind of view the whole process more like a journey of experimentation and discovery, in the sense that I don't really know what a track is going to sound like until I begin writing it, and the composition often reveals itself along the way as things just slot into place. Part of the reason for this is that even when I do have ideas for how something could or should sound, I find it quite difficult to translate those into an actual end result through programming or whatever else. Something just kind of gets lost along the way between my brain and the actual recording, and I seem to forget the initial idea whilst I'm trying to find the right notes in my sequencer. Recently, I've been bombarded with ads on Instagram for various plugins that reportedly allow you to use your voice to compose not just melodies but also drum parts. This is something that I've always been quite interested in, as it skips the middle part where I often get lost in the composition process. But until fairly recently, the technology just hasn't seemed up to scratch to do the job properly. With the various leaps in AI, etc. as of late, it seems that we're now in a position where this could actually potentially work quite nicely. And I noticed one bit of software in particular that seemed especially promising, Dubler 2 from Vochlea, which I'm almost certainly saying incorrectly. I dropped them an email recently and they sent me a 3-month trial to check out the software for myself. And now I'm going to share with you how I found it in practice after a wee bit of initial experimentation. So in order to get Dubler to work, you have to first set it up with whatever microphone you're using to make sure the levels and everything are adjusted for your voice and your equipment. You can use your own interface and mic, of course, but you can't just use the built-in laptop microphone or something like that, because the results won't be very good. I did initially try it out myself with a gaming headset that I had with a wee extendable microphone thing, and whilst it was okay, and kind of struggled to differentiate between sounds, especially when it came to the rhythmical parts. My initial inclination was to use a nice condenser microphone, specifically the Neumann TLM-103. However, what I discovered was that using a dynamic mic seemed to work much better, as the lower sensitivity filtered out, all the unintended noises which might inadvertently be detected as triggers. In my case, I had just used some dirt cheap SM58 clone from Stag, I think it was, and it did the trick nicely. Now, there are quite a lot of features in this software, and I'm not going to go over them all in depth or provide a tutorial on exactly how to use them in this video, but rather I'm just going to give you a quick overview and my thoughts on it so far. Effectively, what this plugin does is converts the audio that you input through the microphone into MIDI information, which can then be edited and used to control various VSTs like the Arturia V-Suite, or even external gear over USB or DIN MIDI if your interface supports that. There are built-in sound generators as well for previews, so you don't have to use a MIDI instrument, although obviously you'll get much better and more comprehensive or a wider range of possible results if you use your own instruments. As part of the recognition and translation process, you can apply various filters and quantizations to make sure that the notes that are being generated are the ones that you actually intended on creating. So in other words, you can strip out all of the bum notes that you might be singing by applying different scales, kind of like auto-tune or something like that. When it comes to the rhythmical parts, you can set up and record different trigger sounds that will then output particular MIDI notes, effectively allowing you to control and sequence drum racks with your voice. So C1 might be a kick drum, F sharp 2 might be a hi-hat, whatever you want, and obviously you can edit all that to suit your particular instrument and how it's set up. One cool thing is that you can save presets with different configurations, so you don't have to go in and set up everything every time you want to use the software or a particular drum synthesizer or whatever else it might be. I would probably recommend though calibrating your mic every session just to make sure that the levels are where they need to be. It only takes a few seconds, so that's not a big deal, but it is really handy to be able to save the scales or the particular sounds you want to use as triggers. Speaking of triggers, one of the main reasons that I wanted to try this software out in particular was a result of its ability to recognise and play rhythmical parts. That is because drums in particular are an area where I often might have an idea for an arrangement, but then struggle in practice to actually sequence that with a hardware sequencer or in my DAW or whatever else. Now, the ability to sing out a rhythmical part seems to have quite a lot of potential there as a more natural way to create beats. However, in practice, it was a wee bit trickier than I had anticipated. For drum triggers, the plugin works by recognising different transients that you set and then associating those with a particular MIDI note. From there, you can then use them to trigger a drum synth or a sampler or whatever else. And at first, I have to be honest, I really struggled to understand how to make more than 3 different sounds that would be recognised distinctly by the plugin, because certain sounds which might sound different to our ears may actually have the same kind of transient beginning, e.g. a closed and open hi-hat, for example. Both of those could end up confusing the plugin into triggering the same sound. Now this means that you need to have quite a good understanding and control of the initial shape of the sounds being produced by your mouth. I'm not a beatboxer by any stretch of the imagination, and so this is not exactly territory in which I am especially comfortable, but things did get much better when I began to focus less on making, realistic, well, maybe not realistic, but making drum sounds with my mouth and more with just making distinct individual pops and clicks, if that makes sense. It's all about articulation, which again, I'm also probably not very good at. Boom, 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 boom. Of course, you aren't just limited to using your mouth though. You can clap your hands, click your fingers, hit pens together, or utilise any other percussive sound so long as they are distinct enough, which does open up some interesting possibilities. It makes me wonder whether or not you could theoretically play in a recording of a drum beat, detect the individual elements, and then convert that to MIDI, though I might be getting a bit ahead of myself here. I am most interested in the vocal part, because if I'm going to be playing out a beat with my hands, then to be honest, I would much rather just use my MPC. Now, it's probably worth noting that there isn't actually any quantization of the MIDI that is being recorded, at least not as far as I'm aware. This is really just trigger and pitch detection, and so the timing is entirely dependent on you. All of that can of course be corrected in your DAW, but if you've got zero sense of rhythm to begin with, then this is probably not going to be useful, at least not with correcting that. In my experimentation, I realised that it was probably pointless to use this method to create drum patterns which could easily be put together in a more traditional sequencer, and instead recognise where the particular strengths of the software lie and make the most of them. For example, writing a more down-tempo kick and snare pairing with a lot of swing and varying levels of velocity would probably work brilliantly, but trying to program a rapidly repeating hi-hat pattern, for example, probably would not. Complex arrangements are also probably not best suited for this approach either, but similarly, if you want a 4 on the floor beat, you'd probably be better off just programming that on a grid anyway. I suspect that the drum trigger feature of this plugin will be most useful for people who either already have an understanding of beatboxing, or for those who want to write more fluid hip-hop, lo-fi, or perhaps trap-style beats, which are a bit more looser by nature. In fact, I can see this being a perfect use case for bringing those kind of ideas to life quite quickly. The other major feature of the software allows you to sing out melodic parts, converting those to MIDI information as well. And as I mentioned earlier, there are scale recognition and quantization functions to ensure that everything is kept nicely in key. What's cool about this is that when you're recording, you can see what notes are being detected, and the visual representation of that is actually really helpful when pitching your voice. Sometimes with auto-tune style plugins, it can throw off your perception a wee bit because what you're hearing isn't necessarily matching up with what is coming out. So that kind of bypasses that. You do need to adjust the settings of the plugin and also modulate your voice to ensure that you aren't inadvertently triggering other notes in the scale when you jump from one to another. And that kind of accuracy can take a bit of practice as a singer. To that end, I found it much easier to record sequences without the MIDI data being sent to a VST, so that you're purely focused on pitching your voice correctly and getting the note recognition bang on. I have enjoyed creating different bits of music with melodic recognition, more so than I thought I might actually, because it feels much quicker to create complementary layers of sound just by singing than having to lay them out manually in a sequencer. On top of that, singing a melody naturally shifts the type and nature of the result that you get, not least because you can't hold a note indefinitely with your voice like you could with a keyboard, so it does change somewhat the way that you might approach composition as well, which I think is always quite a cool thing. It is clear, even from a fairly limited time with Dubler 2, that it is a pretty powerful bit of software. Whilst it was much quicker and more straightforward to set up and use than I expected, it also clearly requires a certain level of skill on the part of the operator. Anytime I've seen adverts for this kind of technology, there are always a bunch of comments about how it's killing creativity and any old fucking idiot can just rock up and sing some terrible off-key melody and create a masterpiece somehow, and that definitely is not the case. This is much more about providing an alternative input mechanism for vocalists or producers that already have some level of experience and, dare I even say it, talent, if not simply the patience and practice to get consistent results. I did find Dubler 2 much easier to understand and use than something like Melodies, for example, and the possibilities of using something as dynamic as your voice to trigger and create MIDI information are pretty exciting. There are some really cool features that I've not really dug into yet, including the ability to use what I would describe as a kind of vocal aftertouch, where the different vowel sounds of your voice can send out MIDI CC data. So for example, a wider ah sound could open a synthesizer's filter a bit wider, or increase the intensity of an LFO, and that's a really cool idea. Similarly, I can also imagine a bunch of different ways to push the limits of this kind of pitch and trigger detection, such as taking non-musical samples like clips of speeches and turning them into lead lines, which is something I'm looking forward to exploring a wee bit more. For me, this software is probably most useful when thought about more as a tool to aid composition, as opposed to something that you would write entire tracks with necessarily. I can see me using it to quickly capture ideas that I might have in my head, in a format that I can then build upon with other devices and more deliberately programmed sequences. This is definitely not going to be everybody's cup of tea, but I can see how incredible it would be for certain types of musicians and producers, and at just over £100, I think that's a pretty reasonable price for the feature set that you're getting. If you go in with a realistic understanding and expectation of what it's capable of, what it isn't, and also lean into those strengths, and this could be a great purchase even if you don't beatbox.